The small Midwestern town of Clearwater, Michigan, woke up slowly that first Friday of December 1988. It was a kind of town where winters arrived early, where the wind scraped against frosted windows, and neighbors waved from driveways already dusted with snow. A town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing bad ever really happened. 19-year-old Lydia Monroe lived on the top floor of a modest two-story apartment building on Willow Creek Road. She was young, soft-spoken, with an easy smile that made people trust her. To the world, she was just another small-town girl. But to those who knew her, Lydia was a survivor, a single mother doing everything she could for her 9-month-old daughter, Hannah. Lydia's life had never been simple. She'd grown up on her parents' farm just outside town, helping her father bale hay and her mother tend chickens before school. She'd joined the Girl Scouts, rode horses, and once dreamed of becoming a teacher. But dreams have a way of bending when life steps in. Her daughter's father, Evan Pierce, was no longer in the picture. He'd left months before Hannah was born. But Lydia didn't crumble. She got her GED, picked up shifts at the local burger barn, and built a quiet little world around her baby. Her apartment wasn't much. A few thrift store chairs, a small Christmas tree, and a shelf of picture books she read aloud at night. But it was warm and safe and hers. That first week of December, Lydia had been excited. It would be Hannah's first Christmas. The tiny apartment glowed with string lights, and soft music played on a cheap radio in the corner. Lydia had even managed to buy a few small gifts, a stuffed bear, a set of building blocks, and a knitted blanket she'd made herself. Her fiancé, Mark Weston, a machine operator at the paper mill, had proposed 2 months earlier. The ring wasn't expensive, but Lydia adored it. They were planning to move in together after the new year. He wasn't Hannah's biological father, but he loved that little girl as his own. That Thursday night, December 1st, Mark and Lydia stayed in, sharing takeout and laughter while the baby slept. Around midnight, they turned in their last normal night. When the morning came, Mark kissed Lydia goodbye just before dawn. He remembered the way she smiled at him, half asleep, her hair messy, holding Hannah on her hip. "Be careful driving," she murmured. "Always," he said. Then he was gone. At 3:40 that afternoon, he returned home. He expected the faint scent of baby lotion, the hum of the radio, maybe the sound of Lydia singing softly from upstairs. Instead, he opened the door to silence. The smell hit first, metallic, sharp, unmistakable. Blood. There were small, dark drops on the kitchen floor, a streak on the wall. And upstairs, the quiet was suffocating. When Mark reached the bedroom, the world fell apart. Lydia was there, or what was left of her. The scene was chaos, violent and deliberate. She had been beaten, strangled, and stabbed. Her nightshirt torn, her body left on the floor. But it was what he saw next that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Across the hall, little Hannah lay sleeping peacefully in her crib, untouched. Her diaper was clean. The radio in the living room played softly, but the dial had been changed to a station Lydia never listened to, easy listening piano music. The bathtub upstairs was running. Someone had stayed. Someone had taken their time. Mark stumbled back, gasping, then bolted from the apartment, shouting for help. Neighbors emerged into the cold air, faces pale and frightened. Within minutes, police sirens shattered the winter stillness. When the first patrol officer, Tom Lasky, entered the apartment, he stopped dead. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Detective Cameron Holt, a 35-year-old veteran of the Clearwater Police Department, was called in. Holt had seen plenty of bad things, but this was something else. The brutality, the strange calm, the untouched baby. It didn't add up. By nightfall, the Monroe apartment was a sea of yellow tape and flashing lights. Neighbors stood outside in their coats, whispering, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sense that something evil had walked among them. Lydia's parents arrived just before 6 p.m., escorted by officers. When her mother saw the baby being carried out, wrapped in a blanket, she broke down completely. "My God," she sobbed, clutching Hannah close. My baby girl, my baby girl." Detective Holt stood nearby, silent, jaw tight. He knew then this wasn't going to be another case. This was going to be the case. The one that would haunt Clearwater for decades. The Monroe apartment stayed sealed for nearly 12 hours. Inside, a crime scene team in white coveralls worked methodically through the night, their cameras flashing like lightning in the dim rooms. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing and the soft swirl of snow carried across the parking lot, a cruel contrast to the horror within. Detective Cameron Holt stood in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold. He had worked homicide before, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong, but this was different. There was something intimate about this crime, something that suggested the killer knew Lydia Monroe. He stepped into the bedroom. The air smelled faintly of bleach and copper. On the carpet, streaks of blood formed half-erased patterns, evidence of someone's desperate attempt to clean up. A lamp was knocked over, the bedsheets torn, and near the dresser lay the twisted remains of a Christmas ornament, shattered in the struggle. "Jesus, Cam," murmured Officer Lasky, shaking his head. Whoever did this wasn't in a hurry. Holt crouched near the bed, studying the details. Lydia's body had been positioned so she faced the open door, facing her daughter's room across the hall. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Then came the detail that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. The bathtub upstairs was still running when police first entered, lukewarm now, but unmistakably full. The killer had likely used it. There were wet footprints on the tile floor. A towel, half damp, draped neatly over the edge of the tub. He hadn't just murdered Lydia Monroe. He had taken his time, cleaned himself, and left calmly. By noon the next day, the entire town of Clearwater was buzzing. Word had spread. A young mother murdered in her home. Her baby untouched. Her fiancé questioned. Reporters crowded outside the police station, their breath clouding in the icy air as they shouted questions to anyone in uniform. Was it a break-in? A domestic dispute? A random killer? Inside the station, Detective Holt and his team began the grim work of reconstruction. Step 1. Recreate the timeline. Mark Weston, the fiancé, had left for work at 5:25 a.m., confirmed by his punch-in record at the paper mill. He returned home around 3:40 p.m. and called for help within minutes. The coroner's estimate placed Lydia's time of death between 11:30 a.m. and 12:15 p.m. That meant someone had entered her home in broad daylight, in a quiet, family neighborhood, and no one had seen a thing. Step 2. Search for evidence. Forensic technician Ellen Franks lifted a single bloody footprint from the bathroom floor, a men's size 9. They also found a faint, partial fingerprint on the phone in Lydia's bedroom, and another on the refrigerator door. The fridge had been wiped down, but under ultraviolet light, 2 strange phrases appeared written and then cleaned away. "Iron Horse" and "Vince was here." At first, Holt thought it was a cruel prank, until he remembered the heavy metal band stickers in Lydia's old photo albums. One of her ex-boyfriends, Vince Keller, had been obsessed with that same nickname, Iron Horse. Step 3. Follow the names. Detectives brought in Vince Keller, a wiry 19-year-old who worked part-time at a local auto shop. He dated Lydia briefly the year before she met Mark. He was cocky, fidgety, and visibly nervous during questioning. When confronted with the writing on the fridge, he smirked. "Yeah, I wrote that once months ago," he said. "At a party." She wiped it off. Didn't think it mattered. But Holt wasn't convinced. Keller's truck had been seen parked near Willow Creek Road that same morning, and his alibi, sleeping late at home, didn't check out. They took his fingerprints and compared them to the prints on the pink phone. No match. They checked the bloody footprint from the bathroom. Keller's boots were a size 11. Another dead end. Still, the case file grew thicker by the hour. They questioned everyone. Lydia's co-workers at the burger barn, the mailman who delivered to her building, even a handyman who had repaired her heating unit the week before. Every answer opened another door, another theory. But the more Holt looked, the more the case seemed to blur. There was no sign of forced entry. No missing valuables. No fingerprints matching anyone in Lydia's life. Whoever did this, she had let them in. And then there was the strangest detail of all, the baby. When paramedics found Hannah, her diaper was clean, freshly changed. Someone had taken care of her after the murder. That meant the killer wasn't panicked. He had been calm, deliberate, maybe even remorseful. It was almost worse than if he'd been purely violent. It suggested calculation, maybe even a kind of twisted empathy. In the following weeks, Clearwater changed. The little town that once left doors unlocked now turned on porch lights at dusk. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Parents wouldn't let their kids walk to school. Detective Holt couldn't shake the image. Lydia's body, the bathtub, the baby asleep just steps away. Every detail haunted him. He carried the case file home each night, reading it over his dinner table while his wife and daughter slept. The first suspect had been cleared. The trail was growing colder by the day, but Holt refused to give up. Late one night, sitting under the harsh light of his office, he flipped through the photos for what felt like the thousandth time. The blood spatter, the cut phone cord, the faint print on the receiver. And there it was, a small note buried in the original report. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, had mentioned seeing a young man in a navy jacket near the building just before noon that day. She thought he was a maintenance worker. The description was vague: brown hair, clean-shaven, average build. But it was something. Run that through every service call in the area. Holt told his team, anyone doing repairs at Week, plumbers, electricians, HVAC, I want a list. 2 days later, the name surfaced. Robert Fields, apprentice plumber, 18 years old in 1988. He'd worked a few jobs in the area that month, including one on Willow Creek Road. But by the time police tracked the company down, Fields had moved, quit the job, disappeared. The year ended with snow and silence. The town tried to move on, but Detective Holt couldn't. He wrote one line in his final report before boxing up the file. The person who killed Lydia Monroe knew her home, her habits, and her heart. He will surface again, and when he does, we'll be waiting. The file was sealed, the box labeled Monroe Homicide, December 2nd, 88, and pushed into a dusty corner of the evidence room. For the next 35 years, it waited. The murder of Lydia Monroe sent ripples through Clearwater that never truly faded. In the weeks after her death, Christmas decorations came down early. Families who once left doors unlocked began checking them twice. The cheerful hum of the small Michigan town dimmed into a kind of watchful quiet, the kind that never really left. The local newspaper, the Clearwater Chronicle, ran updates for months. Young mother slain, police still searching. Then by spring, the headlines faded. New stories took their place. New fears. New seasons. But for Lydia's family, for her parents, and for her little girl, time stood still. Detective Cameron Holt tried to move on too. Cases came and went, but none hit like Lydia's. He kept her file on a separate shelf in his office, a quiet reminder of something unfinished. Once a year, every December, he'd pull it out again, reread the reports, study the photos, and tell himself, we missed something. But the truth was harsher. There wasn't enough to work with. The prints were partial. The blood samples degraded. The bloody footprint matched no one in any database. And the man named Robert Fields, the young plumber's apprentice who'd worked nearby, had vanished like a ghost. By the mid-1990s, Clearwater had changed. The mills had closed. Families moved away. Even the apartment where Lydia died had been repainted, renovated, and rented out again. But some people refused to forget. Hannah Monroe, Lydia's daughter, grew up with fragments, pieces of a life she could never fully remember. A soft laugh in a home video. A woman's hand reaching out to steady a baby learning to walk. The last photo taken of Lydia, smiling, a Christmas tree glowing faintly behind her, hung in the hallway of her grandparents' farmhouse. Her grandmother, Martha, rarely spoke about that day. But sometimes, late at night, Hannah would hear her whispering by the window, talking to someone who wasn't there. Your mama was good, baby, Martha would say softly. She didn't deserve what happened. When Hannah was old enough to ask questions, her grandfather, Frank, gave her the truth in the simplest possible way. They never caught him, he said, but we'll never stop waiting. For Detective Holt, the years blurred. He rose through the ranks, sergeant, then lieutenant, until finally he retired in 2008. On his last day, he walked into the evidence room one final time. He ran his fingers over the box labeled Monroe Homicide and felt that old familiar ache. Don't lose this one, he told the younger detective taking over. We won't, the kid promised. But the world had changed. Forensics had changed. And somewhere in a quiet lab hundreds of miles away, a revolution was just beginning. One that would eventually breathe life back into Lydia's case. By 2015, DNA technology had become the new frontier in law enforcement. Old evidence, once useless, was being retested, sometimes with miraculous results. When the Michigan Cold Case Initiative began funding reviews of unsolved homicides, Lydia's name resurfaced. The dusty envelope containing a tiny biological sample, a trace of the killer left behind on Lydia's torn nightshirt, was sent to the state lab in Lansing. It was a long shot. 30 years is a lifetime for DNA. But when the results came back, technicians found something they didn't expect. A partial male DNA profile. It wasn't enough for a direct hit, but it was something. The profile was uploaded into the National Codes database. Weeks passed, then months, then years. No matches. Still, the file was flagged as active, awaiting further analysis. And that small decision would change everything. In 2022, Detective Aaron Calloway, a 38-year-old investigator newly assigned to the Cold Case Unit, stumbled upon a Monroe file during a digital audit. She had been 6 years old when Lydia was killed. Her mother used to whisper about it when they drove past the old apartment complex. "That poor girl," she'd say, "the one with the baby." Now, decades later, Aaron opened a file on her computer and saw the crime scene photos for the first time. The bathtub, the baby's crib. The radio dialed to the wrong station. Her stomach turned. But beneath the horror, something caught her eye. A familiar notation from the original investigator. Possible suspect, Robert Fields. Plumber, age 18. Untraceable. The name meant nothing at first, but when she ran it through the new state registry, something came up. A Robert A. Fields, born 1970, last known address, Beaufort, South Carolina. Now 53 years old. It was a start. Erin picked up the phone and called her supervisor. "I think I found something," she said. Over the next 6 months, investigators pieced together the puzzle that had lain dormant for 35 years. Using forensic genealogy, they sent the old DNA profile to a specialized private lab in Texas, Genesis Forensics, one of the few facilities capable of rebuilding genetic material from degraded samples. The lab technicians worked in near silence, machines humming as they coaxed fragments of 1988 DNA into readable data. Bit by bit, a new profile emerged, strong enough to cross-reference against open-source genealogy databases. And there it was. A match. Not direct, but close. Third cousins, living in Kentucky and Indiana. The family tree pointed back to one bloodline, one branch, one name that appeared again and again. Fields. When the report came across Detective Calloway's desk, she froze. After 35 years, she whispered, "We finally have him." In early 2023, investigators confirmed the genealogical link to Robert Fields, now living in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was a small business owner, Fields Plumbing and Maintenance, known locally as polite, punctual, and professional. Married, 2 kids, active in the community. No criminal record. No known violence. Just a man who had built a perfectly ordinary life. But beneath the surface of that normalcy, the DNA told a different story. Detectives in Michigan coordinated quietly with South Carolina State Police. They began surveillance. They watched as Fields left for work each morning at 6:30 a.m., coffee in hand, stopping at the same gas station for his usual black roast. He seemed harmless. Until one morning, an undercover officer collected the coffee cup he threw away. The cup was sealed, sent to the lab, and compared to the 1988 sample. When the report came back, it contained just one word: match. After 35 years of silence, the truth had finally spoken. In the spring of 2023, Detective Calloway stood in her office staring at the arrest warrant. Outside, rain lashed against the windows. She thought about the little girl left sleeping in her crib, about the family that had waited a lifetime for a name, about the file that outlived the man who started it. When she finally exhaled, she whispered, "We've got him, Lydia." It was still dark when they arrived. The early morning humidity clung to the quiet streets of Beaufort, South Carolina, as 2 unmarked cars rolled to a stop in front of a neat, Single-story brick house with white shutters and an American flag waving lazily from the porch. Inside, Robert Fields, now 53, sat at his kitchen table, just like he did every morning, sorting through invoices for his plumbing business. The sound of coffee dripping filled the silence. His wife was still asleep. The dog dozed near his feet. It was an ordinary morning, until the knock came. "Mr. Fields," a voice called through the door. "South Carolina State Police. We have a warrant." He frowned, confused. He opened the door. Two detectives stood on the porch, badges flashing in the soft dawn light. One spoke calmly. "Robert Fields, you're under arrest in connection with the 1988 homicide of Lydia Monroe in Clearwater, Michigan." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The invoices slipped from his hand. His face went pale. "What?" he whispered. "What are you talking about?" But the words barely left his mouth before the cuffs clicked shut. By 8 a.m., news was spreading through Beaufort like wildfire. The owner of Fields Plumbing and Maintenance, a man everyone knew, the one who fixed sinks, donated to the church, sponsored the Little League team, had been taken away in handcuffs. His employees gathered in disbelief outside the small workshop on Bay Street. "Rob? No way," said one of his crew. "He's the nicest guy I ever worked for." But miles away in Michigan, the reaction was very different. For the first time in 35 years, the phone rang at the Monroe farmhouse. When Detective Erin Calloway introduced herself, Hannah, now 35 and a mother herself, gripped the receiver tightly. "Ma'am," the detective said softly, "we've identified the man responsible for your mother's death." Hannah didn't speak. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. After a long pause, she whispered, "You found him?" Calloway exhaled. "We did." The arrest stunned the community of Clearwater. The Chronicle resurrected the old headline, 1988 murder solved. Suspect found living in South Carolina. Locals who had grown up under the shadow of Lydia's murder stared at the black and white photos on their screens, unable to believe the man's face. He looked ordinary, friendly even, but beneath that mild expression was a monster who had hidden in plain sight for decades. In the interrogation room in Beaufort, Fields sat across from two detectives, one from South Carolina, one from Michigan. His face was lined, his hands folded neatly on the table. He looked more like a weary businessman than a killer. Detective Calloway slid a photo across the table. Lydia's apartment, December 1988. "Do you recognize this woman?" Fields stared at it for a long time. His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. "Lydia Monroe," Calloway said quietly. "You worked in her neighborhood. You fixed a leaking pipe on Willow Creek Road 3 days before she was murdered." Still silence. She leaned forward. "We have your DNA, Robert, from the scene. It's over." For a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he looked up. "You think you know," he said softly, "but you don't know anything." The following day, he was extradited to Michigan. Cameras swarmed the courthouse steps as officers led him inside. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. "Did you kill her? Why now after all these years?" He kept his head down, his lips pressed into a thin line. Inside, Detective Calloway stood with Hannah Monroe, watching from the gallery as a man who had destroyed her family was finally brought home to face justice. Hannah's hands trembled. She had prepared herself for this moment for years. The knock, the call, the name. But now that it was real, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt hollow, heavy. She turned to the detective beside her. What kind of man does something like this and then goes home, build a life, acts normal? Calloway shook her head. The kind who thinks time will protect him. As prosecutors began building the case, the evidence grew impossible to refute. The DNA from Lydia's assault matched Fields perfectly, 1 in a trillion odds. His old work records placed him within a mile of her apartment the morning of the murder. Witness statements from 1988, once vague, suddenly made sense. The pattern was clear. Fields had returned to the building under the pretense of checking a repair. Lydia let him in. There was no struggle at first. But when he made an advance, and she resisted, something inside him snapped. After killing her, he'd done something that still haunted detectives. He cleaned up, changed the baby's diaper, turned on the radio, and washed himself in the bathtub before calmly walking out. The forensic psychologist who later reviewed the case called it an act of both domination and denial. He wanted control, she said. And once it was over, he tried to erase it, as if he could wash away what he'd done. When the press got hold of the story, it became national news. DNA breakthrough solves 35-year murder flashed across headlines. But in Clearwater, it wasn't a headline. It was the closing of an open wound. Neighbors who remembered Lydia left flowers outside the old apartment building. Someone tied a pink ribbon to the stairwell railing. For a week, people came quietly, mothers, daughters, old friends, standing in silence before walking away. Detective Calloway visited the site too. She stood at the base of the steps, staring at the faded paint and the worn banister. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We kept our promise." Back in South Carolina, the news spread quickly. Customers called Field's old business line, stunned. One woman told a local reporter, "He fixed my sink last year. He was so polite. Said God bless me when he left." It was the same refrain from everyone who knew him. He didn't seem the type, but monsters rarely do. 2 months later, at a press conference in Lansing, Chief of Police Randall Holt, Cameron Holt's son, stood before reporters. His father had passed away years earlier, but the case he couldn't solve had finally found its ending. Holding up a worn manila folder marked Monroe homicide, he said, "This case represents what happens when we don't give up, when families don't stop hoping, and when science finally catches up with evil." In Clearwater, Hannah sat at her kitchen table, a photo of her mother beside a burning candle. Her own daughter played nearby, humming to herself. She looked at the picture, the soft eyes, the easy smile, and whispered, "They found him, Mom." And for the first time in her life, she let herself cry. The courthouse in St. Joseph County, Michigan, had not seen this much attention in decades. Satellite trucks crowded the narrow street. Reporters packed the steps. The words "cold case solved after 35 years" ran across every TV screen in the state. Inside, in the sterile glow of courtroom lights, Robert Field sat at the defense table wearing a beige jumpsuit. The confident, easygoing plumber from South Carolina was gone. In his place was a man whose face looked suddenly smaller, paler, and utterly hollow. Across the aisle sat Hannah Monroe, the baby who had survived that December day. Now 35, she watched with quiet intensity, her mother's same eyes staring across the room at the man who had taken everything from her before she could even speak. Beside her, Detective Erin Calloway sat still, notebook closed, hands folded. Her job was done, but her promise wasn't. The prosecution began with a statement that silenced even the reporters in the back row. 35 years ago, Prosecutor James Keaton said, his voice steady, a young mother named Lydia Monroe was brutally murdered in her home. The man who did it thought time would bury the truth. But time didn't forget. Science didn't forget. And justice didn't forget. He turned toward the jury. "We have his DNA. We have his work records. We have his name." On the defense side, attorney Paul Grayson leaned forward. "My client," he said smoothly, "is a family man, a respected business owner. There is no physical evidence placing him at the scene beyond a degraded sample collected 3 decades ago, a sample handled by multiple people under outdated conditions. That's not justice. That's desperation." But as the trial unfolded, the defense's confidence began to erode. The prosecution's case was built piece by piece, a tapestry of science and patience. A forensic expert took the stand first, explaining how the DNA preserved on Lydia's nightshirt had survived through decades of humidity, dust, and storage. She described the process that turned those degraded fragments into a full genetic profile, one that matched Field's down to the tiniest genetic marker. Next came Detective Calloway, walking the jury through the evolution of the investigation. She showed the old photos, the fingerprints, the size 9 footprint, the phone cord cut cleanly with a blade. And then, the quiet reveal. We confirmed that in 1988, Robert Fields was an apprentice plumber who serviced homes within 1 mile of Lydia's apartment the week of her death. She paused. He had access. He had tools. He had opportunity. When Hannah Monroe took the stand, the entire courtroom fell silent. She spoke softly, her voice breaking only once. "I don't remember her," she said, "but I've felt her absence every day of my life. Birthdays, graduations. When my daughter was born, I kept thinking how my mom never got that chance." She turned to face Fields. "For 35 years, you lived free. You built a life, while mine began with loss." Her words didn't accuse. They simply existed in the air, heavy and undeniable. The defense tried to discredit the genealogy process, calling it experimental, arguing that DNA could have been transferred or mishandled. But then the prosecutor played a short video, surveillance footage from a gas station in Beaufort, showing Fields tossing away his coffee cup. "Ladies and gentlemen," Keaton said, "this is the cup that proved what Robert Fields has hidden for 35 years. And when the lab expert confirmed that the DNA from that cup matched the sample from the Monroe murder scene exactly, even the defense attorney stopped taking notes. Outside the courthouse, the story captured national attention. True crime podcasts dissected every development. TV crews parked outside every morning, their breath fogging the winter air as they delivered live updates. But inside, it was still just one simple truth echoing through the trial. A young mother had trusted the wrong man, and he had believed that time would erase his crime. On the seventh day of testimony, Prosecutor Keaton presented his closing argument. "Mr. Fields lived an entire lifetime after taking Lydia Monroe's," he said quietly. "He changed her daughter's diaper after the murder. He washed his hands in her home. He walked out the door and never looked back. He let the silence hang. That's not a man who lost control. That's a man who made a choice." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The forewoman stood, her voice calm but resolute. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Fields, guilty of first-degree murder." A sound rippled through the room. Gasps, quiet sobs, the release of 35 years of waiting. Hannah closed her eyes. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "It's over." But it wasn't joy she felt. It was exhaustion, relief, and an ache she knew would never fully fade. Fields sat motionless as the verdict was read. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked his age, an old man who'd finally run out of time. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood slowly. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered. "I was young. Stupid. I panicked." He looked at Hannah. "I'm sorry." But she didn't look away. Her eyes, her mother's eyes, were steady. And in that moment, his words meant nothing. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside, the air was cold but clear. Reporters swarmed, microphones raised, but Hannah didn't stop. She walked straight to the steps, her daughter's small hand in hers. Detective Calloway caught up beside her. "You okay?" Hannah nodded faintly. "It's strange," she said. "All these years, I imagine what justice would feel like." She looked toward the horizon, pale blue sky over the courthouse dome. "It doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like peace." Calloway smiled gently. "That's all your mother ever wanted." The first snowfall of the season came quietly to Clearwater that December morning in 2023. Almost 35 years to the day since Lydia Monroe's murder. It dusted the rooftops, softened the streets, and blanketed the town in a fragile kind of peace. For the first time in decades, the air around Willow Creek Road felt still, as if the place itself had been waiting for closure. The old apartment building where Lydia once lived was still there. The paint had faded, the address number slightly rusted, but the outline was unmistakable. A single candle flickered in the window of her former unit, placed there by someone who still remembered. Detective Erin Calloway stood outside in the cold, her breath fogging in the air. She wasn't on duty that day, but she came anyway. A habit, maybe, a promise. She'd been a child when the murder happened, and now, after all these years, she was the one who'd helped bring it full circle. She pulled her coat tighter and whispered to the empty street, "You can rest now, Lydia. We kept our word." Then she walked away, leaving the candles glow behind her, a small, silent victory against the dark. At the same time, Hannah Monroe was at the small cemetery on the edge of town, standing before a granite headstone carved simply with her mother's name. Lydia Monroe, 1969 to 1988, loved beyond measure. The snow clung to the edges of the stone, melting under her fingertips. Her daughter, Ella, stood beside her, holding a single white rose. Was Grandma really my age when she had you? Ella asked. Hannah smiled faintly. A little older, but she was brave. Braver than she should have had to be. Ella placed the rose at the base of the headstone. She'd be proud of you, she said softly. Hannah nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I hope so. The trial had ended. The cameras were gone. But for Hannah, life after justice was quieter, heavier, in a way she hadn't expected. She'd spent her whole life imagining the day she'd finally hear the name of the man who killed her mother. Now that it had come, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 35 years. In the weeks that followed, she found herself doing small things to reconnect with a woman she'd never known. Cooking Lydia's favorite dishes from her grandmother's recipes, listening to songs found on her old mixtapes, reading the same children's books Lydia had once bought for her. And when she rocked her daughter to sleep at night, she'd hum the same lullaby that had once played softly in that apartment. The one the killer had left running on the radio. But now, the sound wasn't haunting anymore. It was healing. Across the country in South Carolina, the plumbing shop that once bore the field's plumbing and maintenance sign was shuttered, its windows boarded up. The man who'd built a life on lies was now just another inmate number in a Michigan prison system, a ghost stripped of the humanity he pretended to have. The people who once called him neighbor, boss, or friend rarely spoke his name anymore. It was as though he'd been erased from their lives, replaced by the echo of something far older, far truer. A man can hide from the world, but not from the truth. And sometimes the truth just waits, buried in an evidence box, sleeping until the right eyes open again. On the anniversary of the verdict, the Clearwater Chronicle ran one final story. Its headline read, "Justice at last. Cold case solved after 35 years brings peace to a family in a town." The article ended with a quote from the late Detective Cameron Holt, written decades earlier in his own hand, preserved in a case file. The person who killed Lydia Monroe knew her home, her habits, and her heart, but he forgot something. The truth doesn't die, it just waits. That line became the closing words of the report, and the closing words of the film that a true crime documentary would later produce about the case. In the final scene, the camera would pan across a snow-covered Michigan field. A soft voice, Hannah's, would narrate, "My mother didn't live to see justice, but I did. And maybe that's how life works. One generation carries the pain, so the next can finally breathe." The wind would rise gently, sweeping across the frame, carrying the sound of church bells from the town below. Then, as the screen faded to black, the text would appear. In memory of Lydia Monroe, 1969 to 1988. Solved through forensic genealogy, 2023. When the credits rolled, the candle in Lydia's apartment window would still be burning. A small, steady light against the dark, a reminder that truth may sleep, but it never dies. And somewhere in the stillness of winter, it would almost feel like the town of Clearwater could finally, after 35 long years, take its first quiet breath again.